This morning, we start things off talking about that Petrotrin, the OWTU, averted strike, thankfully. We didn't really see, I don't think, too many people at the gas pumps. I don't know if they were hoping and praying, that, this would not have happened. Thankfully, it didn't. This morning, I do have with me Trevor Bailey, who is an industrial relations consultant, to talk to us a little bit more about what took place with this strike action or intended strike action that thankfully didn't come to pass yesterday, with the OWTU choosing to take the 5% increase, and of course with some conditions. So good morning to you, Mr. Bailey. Thank you so much for being here on GMTV.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so thankfully the settlement, the OWTU settled for 5% yesterday, but with some conditions. Can you elaborate on some of that?
Well, I'm not too okra with what the conditions are, but I think before going much further into the situation, this needs to be put into some context. Is it? Are you all right? Yeah, it needs to be put into some context. Now, there is a prevailing view among individuals and groups and participants in the industrial relations system that the industrial relations system is, in and of itself, on its own, and because of that is that it is overlooked that the industrial relations system is also part of the whole subsystem, like the political system is and the economic system. And because of that is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding that results in what I would call conceptual difficulties, so that those that are involved in the industrial age, or some of them rather, in terms of seeking out their objectives and employing the strategies that they do, they end up not being very successful at times and militate against the whole system of itself. So that there are some fundamental, I think, and structural issues that needs to be addressed that at the end of the day is that requires a paradigm shift in terms of how industrial relations is approached. And if that is not addressed, and I think addressed quickly and in the shortest possible time, it means that we would continue to have situations like what would have just sort of partially stopped yesterday. And as you would have alluded to in your opening, is that you do have negotiations coming up with the protective services, is that you have negotiations coming up with a whole lot of other people. So then what is going to happen? Are we now going to see that the situation that existed with Petrotrin, whether that is going to be a yardstick by which other unions would approach the industrial relations? And it certainly, I think, that does not augurs well if that continues to be the case.
I know that there's always been the call, as it should be, negotiations, wage negotiations should begin long before the actual date, the deadline date for it, for example, 2011, 2014. That only now really, I mean, the dates have been passed. I think it's 6 months it's supposed to start before wage negotiations, so how long before the end of those contracts? For some reason, we don't tend to meet those deadlines. Which is how, we end up in situations that we end up in with the OWTU. I don't know what's going to happen with the police service and fire services. They have even mentioned that with their last negotiations, certain promises that were made to them in those negotiations, they did not get. They were supposed to get, I believe it was a 50% increase, 50% in arrears in cash, and the remainder in bonds, and of course housing allocation. Those things were also promised to them, to the fire services. Till now, that has not been delivered to the fire services. So how does that impact? Those things were promised, they were not delivered in the last wage negotiations, and now they're into another set of negotiations. How does that impact on everything?
Well, it's obviously going to impact negatively, particularly in our straitened economic circumstances. But I think there's sufficient blame to go all around. Generally, in most collective agreements, what you would find is that there's an article which says that either party, prior to the expiration of the collective agreement, let's say with 90 days, can submit proposals for the new ensuing period. That is never done. And there's a propensity on the part of the parties to allow this thing to drag on until the first year, the second year. And what you find is that in some cases the union seem to sort of cherry pick certain times and situations where they would make these strident claims against the employer. And it more often than not comes at a time where it appears that either the employer, whether it be government or whatever, is under some sort of strain to see how best that they can exact whatever they want to think. And I think all of that is included in the whole approach to industrial relations. If you look at a comparative situation, let's say in North America, is that if an agreement is finishing tomorrow, at least by 12 o'clock of the night, is that you have another agreement in place, and it goes on. And it puts a tremendous burden on, let's say for instance, the very members themselves and the company, because it involves a whole lot of back pay, and sometimes the employers may not have the readily cash available, and then you have to go into arrangements where now that this thing has to be paid, or find different ways in which you're paying, which is not, and further prolong the situation. So I think all of that is included in the whole approach to collective bargaining.
Yeah. Something I wanted to ask, if it's common practice, because you mentioned internationally as well, we have a tendency here, contracts come to an end, negotiations are still going on, and people continue to work without contracts in the hope that, you know, things will be negotiated, things will happen and all of that. Is that common practice, or is it that when your contracts end, that's the end of it internationally, and that's it? Or does work continue?
Well, in Trinidad and Tobago, it is that even though the collective agreement expires, it doesn't come to an end. Mm-hmm. So that there is some statutory protection for it, that where this collective agreement or the terms of or the articles in the collective agreement become the terms of contract for the individual employer, so that he continues enjoying the benefits that he would have had in his previous agreement until a new agreement is reached.
Okay. How is this going to impact Petrotrin, and the economy as well? Because the statement, you know, was continuous. We don't have the money. The economy cannot afford it right now. Petrotrin is already at a loss. You know, it's cash strapped as it is. Roger says that it's not going to affect it in any way. How will it really? Will it affect Petrotrin in any significant way? Will it affect the country as well, the country's economy in any way?
Well, this is precisely the point that I was making, or that I was alluding to earlier, where it is that some people in the industrial relations system see the industrial relations system operating on its own, but it is a subsystem of the society like any other system, whether it be political or the economic. So then what impacts on the economic and political system would invariably impact on all the other systems in society. So that if it is that we do not sort of come to that realization and understand that follows, then I'm sure that the situation would continue, however you look at it. Another aspect of it as well is that remember that you're dealing with the state, and in industrial relations is that the state is commonly referred to as the three-headed monster. And what that really means is that one is that you're dealing with the state as the government, is that you're dealing with the state as the legislator, and you're dealing with the state as employer. Now the state or the government rather, has the responsibility of looking after all the whole population, so that whatever demands you make on it is that the government would have to look at it in the context of its ability to provide for the wider society. And it is well known that public sector negotiations and private sector negotiations, they are very, very difficult, or different rather.
Yeah.
So that the approach you would use in public sector negotiations, you may not or cannot necessarily use it in private sector negotiations. So you have a whole lot of things that is now descending upon the industrial relations system that need those that are participating in it to have some level of understanding and understand what is really taking place, so that there could be some paradigm shift. Let's say, for instance, is that you have the whole question of globalization, where how globalization has impacted on the whole international economy. It has also changed the nature of work. It has also changed the relationship between employer and employee. It has changed the relationship between employee and employee. So there are some new things that are there that we would have to come to terms with and find ways in which we can do that. And there are collective bargaining or negotiation approaches that can be used that would develop specifically for these circumstances. For instance, is that you have an approach to collective bargaining that they call the mutual gains bargaining approach. That was developed by the Cornell University School of Industrial Relations in the 1990s. What that approach does, it focuses on the interests of the parties as opposed to the positions. You would also have what it is you call concessionary bargaining, where in economic situations like this is that the parties look at what the situation are, and both parties give up things in order to have a certain common objective. In our own Trinidad situation, I think it is Dr. Andre Henry, or Vincent Henry, I think it was, who would have developed this PROMALCO, as it called, is that the promotion between management and labor, which is similar to what the mutual gains and the concessionary bargain is like. But the thing about it is, and I say so in particular the employer class, what the employer class needs to do is to see how best they can get people who sort of understand these things and are able to push those things at the bargaining table. And what that would do at the end of the day is help develop the jurisprudence in the very industrial relations system.
And that actually does sound like something that could work. I don't know when Trinidad and Tobago is actually going to get there. I don't know if that has to take a whole mindset change with respect to the bargaining parties involved. I'm not sure, because that does sound like, you know, that can form an amicable resolution to wage negotiations and bargaining, collective bargaining and all that. We do have, as I said, you know, the police, fire services coming up as well, tutors also coming up. We can only hope that it does not end the way, or go through the process, unfortunately, the way that this did. I mean, we have come to the point where 5% is being awarded to the OWT workers, the Petrotrin workers, and that has to be paid by the 28th, and then other negotiations are going to be taking place after that. So we can only hope that somewhere along the way that good sense will prevail with respect to industrial relations, and, you know, we can follow best practices where that is concerned. I want to thank you for taking the time, coming and sharing with us this morning, Industrial Relations Consultant Trevor Bailey, and letting us know, because I think things need to change. The way that we do things need to change if we really want to be cohesive, if we really want to be able to work together, if we really want to get to some consensus. So I can only hope, as I said. So thank you for coming and explaining that to us here this morning on Good Morning Trinidad and Tobago.
Oh, thank you for having me.